So how does a pretty small fight between a couple of fishermen in the Caribbean end up feeling like Homer's Odyssey? And in this world we live in now, always moving, people constantly crossing borders, what does it even mean to feel unhomely? Which isn't homeless, right? It's something else, this feeling of being split. And maybe the big one for us readers is the novel, the big long story. Is it actually dying, with all the distractions? Or are things like Twitter, maybe even fan fiction, becoming the new way we tell stories globally? Welcome to a new episode from our series, The Story of Literature, from English Plus Podcast. We have been on quite a journey in this series, haven't we? Covering centuries, building this huge mental bookshelf. We started way back, ancient Mesopotamia, listening to Gilgamesh grappling with death. Then we sailed with Homer, went deep with Dante, stood on Shakespeare's stage, walked those dark Russian streets with Dostoevsky, and saw writers from Latin America, Africa, reclaim their own histories. It's massive.
It really has. An incredible suite. And, through all that, especially getting closer to our time, say the 20th century, this theme just kept getting louder, didn't it? The whole struggle over identity for writers coming out of former colonies, Latin America, Africa. Asia literature wasn't just art, it was, essential. It was the way to dig up histories that had been buried, deliberately sometimes, and to shape an identity that empires tried to squash.
Exactly. But now, here we are, 21st century, and things feel different. That identity struggle, it's not just happening in specific regions anymore. You could argue it's become the global condition almost. So we really want to explore what happens now. What happens when that feeling of being between worlds, maybe having a hyphen in your identity, feeling connected everywhere online, but also kind of adrift. When that experience is shaped by these two huge forces, just massive global movement of people and technology connecting everyone all the time.
And what's really striking is how 21st century literature is just reflecting this almost immediately. This new reality of borders seeming blurrier, cultures mixing in really complex ways. We're shifting, I think, from those more regional identity fights to something genuinely global, a story that involves anyone who's ever moved or felt pulled between places. So, we'll need to properly unpack this idea of the unhomely, and we'll look at how writers today are kind of taking old traditions, classical stories even, and reshaping them for this reality. And crucially, how technology isn't just a threat, maybe, but actually a catalyst. It's changing the game for the written word.
Okay, so let's start with that big context. We have to talk about migration, movement. It's just fundamental to our time, isn't it?
Absolutely fundamental. Whether it's people choosing to move maybe for work or study or family, or being forced to move because of conflict, climate change, persecution. It's just the engine driving so much of 21st century life. The sheer numbers are staggering. More people living outside their birth country now than ever before in history.
Wow. That statistic alone, it takes it beyond just politics, doesn't it? It becomes about psychology, about stories.
Exactly. Because this constant movement creates these huge diasporas, right? Communities spread all over the globe, but still feeling this deep, sometimes complicated, sometimes painful tie to a homeland that's far away. And maybe homeland isn't just distant in miles, but distant in time too. Like the older generation remembers it one way, but the place has changed, or the younger generation only knows it through stories.
And that distance, that split, that's where the literature comes from, right? That tension, the feeling of being in between. You're here, speaking this language, living this culture, but your memories, your history, maybe even just the taste of certain food pulls you back somewhere else.
That tension is incredibly fertile ground for writers. And this brings us right to a really key idea for understanding literature today. The concept of the unhomely, claimed by the post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha. We need to be careful with this term, though. It's often misunderstood.
Okay, let's spend a moment on that. You said it's not the same as being homeless. So what is it? What's that feeling, that unhomely state really about?
Right, the distinction is crucial. Homelessness is about lacking physical shelter, a place to live. The unhomely Bhabha uses the German unheimlich, which also connects to Freud's idea of the uncanny, the strangely familiar. It's more of an existential thing, a psychological state. It's that deep nagging feeling that you're fundamentally a stranger, an outsider, in the country you live in now. But, and this is the really complex part, the paradox, you'd also feel like a stranger if you went back to the place you left.
Why is that? Because the place changed or because you've changed?
Both, often. Maybe the home country has moved on, politically or culturally. Or maybe you, the person who left, have absorbed so much of the new place, the language, the way of thinking, that you just don't quite fit back into the old one anymore either. You've changed too much.
So it's this feeling of permanent disorientation. Your identity is split across maybe two cultures, two histories, two languages, and you can't fully settle into either one. It sounds exhausting.
It can be exhausting, absolutely. But Paba argues that this space created by the split, he calls it the third space, is actually incredibly powerful, especially for a writer.
Oh, so if you don't belong anywhere.
Well, for the individual, maybe it's full of anxiety, but for the writer, that in-between position, that edge, offers this amazing vantage point. It gives them a kind of double vision. They can look at the culture they left behind and the culture they're currently in with a critical sharpness, a clarity that someone who's only ever known one place might not have. They see both worlds from a slight distance, and that double vision, that's really defining so much of the best global writing today.
That makes sense, but is there a risk, though? If you're always writing from that third space, from the margins of both worlds, do you maybe end up not quite connecting fully with either audience? Just trying to be universal sometimes water down the specific reality.
That's the constant balancing act, isn't it, for any writer working across cultures? The fear of being misunderstood or having to constantly explain yourself, it's definitely real. But the real power, I think, comes when writers manage to move beyond that binary. They're not just trying to fit into the old imperial center's expectations or trying to conform to some strict idea of tradition back home. They get this freedom to invent totally new ways of telling stories, ways that can actually hold the messiness, the complexity of having 2, 3, multiple worlds inside you at once. That's where the really radical innovation is happening.
Okay, that idea of the third space really sets us up for thinking about how writers use that position, how they reclaim stories, especially stories that used to be told mainly by, well, colonial powers. For a long time, especially in the 20th century, the typical story often went one way, didn't it? Writers moving from the colonies to the big centers, London, Paris, New York.
Definitely. And if you want a region that just embodies that history, colonialism, slavery, forced migration, constant mixing, and then the literary triumph that came out of it, you have to look at the Caribbean. It produced this incredible generation of writers who basically took the English language, the language of the colonizer, and reshaped it from the perspective of those who had been on the receiving end of empire. They wrote from the center, but about the experience of the periphery.
And the towering figure there has to be Derek Walcott, right?
Yeah.
Nobel laureate from St. Lucia. He seemed to live that internal split his whole life, his very European classical education versus his Caribbean roots, his reality. That line of his always gets me.
Oh, the one? I who am poisoned with the blood of both, where shall I turn, divided to the vein?
Yes, that's it. It just perfectly captures that agony, that unhomely feeling baked into his history.
It really does. But then his answer to that question, where shall I turn, wasn't despair. It was this monumental, absolutely breathtaking, epic poem, Omeros, which of course means Homer in Greek. And the poem itself is this incredible act of, well, reclaiming history, literary sovereignty.
So he takes Homer, the foundation of Western literature, and brings it to St. Lucia. How did that work? What did it mean to shrink, say, the Trojan War down to a fight between local fishermen?
It was radical. What Walcott was doing was basically saying, our history here on this small island right now has the same weight, the same epic scope, the same human tragedy and heroism as ancient Greece. He wasn't just borrowing Homer, he was asserting equivalence. So yeah, the huge battles of the Iliad become this bitter argument between two local fishermen, Achilles and Hector, over a fishing spot, and maybe over Helen, who isn't the face that launched 1,000 ships, but a beautiful local housemaid.
Wow. So he grounds these massive ancient figures in the everyday life, the dialect, the heat of St. Lucia.
Exactly. He takes the pillars of the Western canon and plants them firmly in Caribbean soil. It's a way of saying our story, the story of this place forged by history and the sea, is just as epic. And that brings us to the sea itself, which is so central for Walcott. He makes this explicit link. The sea that separates his characters from Africa, the sea of the Middle Passage, the trauma. It's the same sea that brought the colonizers, the same sea that these fishermen now depend on for their living.
So the sea connects everything.
It connects everything. It embodies that split identity, but also the resilience. It leads right back to that incredibly powerful temple phrase of his, the sea is history. He's saying the Caribbean story, this ongoing story of movement and survival, is the living epic. It's not just something in old books.
That's incredibly powerful. And that idea, reclaiming the narrative, finding the epic in the local, it's not just the Caribbean, is it? If we shift across the globe, maybe to Oceania, to Australia, we see something similar happening with indigenous writers there, right? Challenging that dominant narrative of white settlement.
Oh, absolutely. For a long time, the main story told about Australia was the settler story. the story of arrival, discovery. But that's being fundamentally challenged, rewritten by a wave of First Nations writers. They're telling a much, much older story, a story connected to the land itself, to country, in a way that settler narratives just couldn't.
And a key example there would be Alexis Wright from the Oceania Nation.
Right.
Her novel Carpentaria sounds like, well, more than just a novel. It sounds immense.
And it is immense. It's like a force of nature. Carpentaria is set in the Gulf of Carpentaria. It spans generations, but it deliberately breaks the mold of a typical novel. Wright does this incredible thing where she weaves together simultaneously these different layers of time. You have the ancient ancestral stories of the dreaming, the creation time, the spiritual foundation. Then you have this really sharp political critique of the damage being done right now by big mining companies. And then you have this cast of just unforgettable, wild, resilient characters living through it all.
So it's like past, present, future, myth, politics, all happening at once. How does that actually feel to read? What's the language like?
The language is, well, it's not neat. It's described as this lyrical flood, almost. It can be funny, angry, beautiful, challenging. But the crucial thing is, its power, its rhythm, its whole way of telling the story, it doesn't come from the tradition of the English novel. It comes from Aboriginal oral storytelling traditions. Deep, ancient ways of passing on knowledge and history.
Can you give an example of how that oral tradition changes the structure? Like, what does it do differently from a standard novel?
Well, think about a typical Western novel, usually pretty linear, right? Follows characters A, B, C through a plot. Wright's novel, drawing on oral forms, is much more fluid. Time isn't strictly linear. Perspectives shift constantly. A character might suddenly seem connected to a dreaming ancestor. The viewpoint might jump from a person to, say, the river itself, then back centuries. There's repetition, poetry, a kind of incantatory quality.
So the structure itself is a statement.
It absolutely is. It's literary sovereignty. By refusing to structure the story according to the conventions of the colonizers' literature, she's saying, this land has its own stories, its own way of speaking, and we, the original people of this land, will tell it in our voice, drawing on our traditions. It's a powerful declaration of independence written onto the page.
That idea of changing the form, moving away from the rigid structure of the old novel to something more fragmented, more layered, that leads us perfectly into the next big force, technology. It feels like, just as our identities got more fragmented through movement and global connection, the technology we use for stories fragmented too. The internet, smartphones, social media, just constant information, constant distraction.
Exactly. And this is where you hear that recurring panic, right? It pops up every few years. The novel is dead. The worry is that our attention spans, trained by, 10-second videos and endless scrolling, are just fundamentally broken for deep reading. We live in this hyperlinked world, everything instant. So the fear is, can people still commit to a dense 600-page book? Is that kind of immersion just gone?
It feels like a real concern. If we communicate in 280 characters or quick video clips, where does that long, slow unfolding of a traditional narrative fit in? Has it been pushed out?
Well, this is where it gets fascinating, and actually maybe more hopeful than you'd think. Because technology hasn't just been a threat, it's also been this huge catalyst for evolution. It's forced writers to get creative, to find totally new forms that actually work with the digital world, not just fight against it.
Okay, so what kind of new forms are we talking about? It's more than just reading a book on a Kindle, right?
Oh, much more. You've got things like electronic literature. This is where the digital medium isn't just delivering the text, it's part of the text. Think about hypertext novels, especially from the early web days. You don't read page 1, page 2, page 3. You read by clicking links within the story. Each click takes you on a different path. So every reader experiences a slightly different narrative, making different connections. It kind of mirrors how we navigate information online, doesn't it? That branching, nonlinear experience.
Right. The reader shapes the story through their choices, fragmented and interactive. And then you have things that embrace the limits of platforms. Like, didn't Jennifer Egan write a story on Twitter?
Exactly. Black Box. Back when Twitter had that 140-character limit, it was this cool sci-fi spy story told entirely in these tiny bursts. Egan wasn't fighting the limit, she was using it. That brevity, the staccato rhythm, the way it appeared in a feed, it created this urgent piecemeal feeling that was totally modern. The form fit the content and the platform.
Like reading intelligence intercepts or something?
Precisely.
Yeah.
But maybe the biggest, most widespread, and honestly often ignored evolution happening right now is fan fiction.
Fan fiction. You see that as a major literary evolution, not just, people playing in someone else's sandbox.
I really do. Because look at the scale of it. Platforms like Archive of Our Own, AO3, have millions and millions of users. These aren't just readers anymore, they're writers. They take these huge universes, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Marvel, whatever, and they remix them, reinterpret them, expand them, explore characters and relationships the original creators didn't. It's this incredibly active, participatory culture. Entire genres have sprung up within fan fiction, often exploring identity, gender, sexuality, in ways mainstream publishing is still catching up with.
So what does that massive participation tell us about storytelling itself if people consume a story and then immediately want to write their own version?
I think it shows that the basic human drive isn't just to receive stories passively. It's to live inside them, to play with them, to make them our own. Fan fiction is almost like a vast digital oral tradition, where stories aren't fixed by one author, but are constantly retold, reshaped, debated by a community. It proves the urge to inhabit narratives is incredibly strong. Technology just gave us a new global campfire to do it around.
And technology has changed circulation too, hasn't it? Getting books around the world, bypassing the old gatekeepers.
Absolutely, that's huge. A book published somewhere relatively small can explode globally overnight. Not because a big publisher decided it would, but because people are talking about it online, like on TikTok, with #BookTalk. It creates this instant global conversation that ignores borders. Readers are discovering and promoting books directly, which definitely reduces the power of the traditional literary hubs in, say, New York or London to dictate what counts.
Okay, so if books are traveling instantly, being discussed globally, what does world literature even mean now? Does it just mean everything if it's all potentially accessible?
That's a really important question. And no, it doesn't just mean all the literature from everywhere. The way scholars tend to use the term now, world literature, isn't just a category of everything. It's more about a specific mode of circulation and a specific mode of reading. Basically, a book becomes world literature when it successfully travels beyond its original culture, crosses language barriers, and manages to resonate with a global audience. It has to speak to something universal, even if it's rooted in a very specific place.
And the key figures making that travel possible, the ones letting these stories cross languages, are the translators, right?
Absolutely crucial. Translators are the unsung heroes here. They're the bridges. They don't just swap words. They have to navigate entire cultures, nuances, histories to bring a story alive in a new language. Without them, global literature simply wouldn't exist. A masterpiece in, say, Korean or Arabic would just stay within its own linguistic borders. Translation is this incredibly complex act of cultural interpretation.
So putting it all together, this age of migration, digital connection, hybrid identities, what does the truly representative 21st century global novel feel like? How does it manage to be global and specific at the same time?
I think the quintessential global novel today is one that has that feeling of migration, of being between worlds, just baked right into its DNA. It's in the structure, the themes, the characters' experiences. These are often books that feel strangely at home everywhere because they're about that feeling of not quite being at home anywhere. They capture that unhomely condition we talked about, make it feel universal. They find ways, structurally or through metaphor, to communicate that sense of displacement instantly.
Okay, let's look at a couple of examples that do this brilliantly, but in really different ways. First, Mohsin Hamid's Exit West. He's Pakistani-British, and he uses this one touch of magical realism to tackle the refugee crisis.
Right, the famous magical doors. In the novel, the main characters, Saeed and Nadia, need to escape their city as it descends into war. Now, a purely realist novel might focus on the incredibly difficult, dangerous physical journey. The smugglers, the borders, the camps. Hamid chooses to sidestep that. He introduces these mysterious black doors that just appear. You step through one and suddenly you're somewhere else. Maybe a Greek island, maybe London, maybe California. Instant transportation.
Why do that? Why use magic to bypass the reality of the journey, which is so central to the refugee experience?
I think it's a stroke of genius, actually. By removing the specific, often overwhelming mechanics of the physical journey, Hamid forces the reader to confront the emotional and psychological core of displacement. You focus entirely on the fear, the loss of home, the shock of arrival, the confusion, the challenge of trying to build a life from scratch in a totally alien environment. The door becomes a metaphor for that sudden, violent rupture that happens to refugees, making that political reality feel like a shared human experience of loss, but also maybe possibility.
That's really smart.
Yeah.
Okay, and then for a completely different approach structurally, there's Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish Nobel winner. Her novel Flights seems to embody this fragmented, globalized world in its very form.
Flights is maybe maybe the perfect example of a novel whose structure is the message about our times. It deliberately avoids a single, straightforward plot. It's often called a constellation novel. Imagine a sky full of stars, points of light that seem separate but form patterns.
A constellation novel.
Yeah.
So what are the stars and flecks? What are the fragments made of?
They're incredibly varied. You get short fictional stories, historical bits like this amazing recurring story about a 17th century Dutch anatomist preserving body parts. You get philosophical thoughts about travel and anatomy, essays, even notes from the narrator's own journeys. She's always moving, always observing.
It sounds potentially chaotic, or is there thread holding it together?
There is a thread, definitely. The core theme is movement itself, the human need to travel, physically and mentally, and the connections we make in those in-between spaces, airports, hotels, museums. But the genius is that it's structure fragmented, jumping between topics, looping back, full of digressions, yet somehow interconnected, perfectly mirrors how we experience life now. Think about browsing the internet, clicking links, juggling multiple conversations. Flights captures that feeling. It reflects the constant flow of information, the sense of being everywhere and nowhere. The reader has to actively make the connections, find the patterns between the fragments, which is exactly what we do every day to make sense of our hyper-connected world.
So looking back over this whole series, it's quite something. We started millennia ago with someone trying to etch a story onto clay just to hold on to it to stop it from disappearing. And now here we are ending this deep dive talking about potentially billions of people sharing story fragments instantly, globally, with a tap on a screen. The technology is almost unrecognizably different.
It is. But, the fundamental reason why we do it, that core human impulse, I don't think it's changed at all. We tell stories to try and make sense of things, right? Make sense of the world, our place in it, especially when everything feels like it's changing so fast. We tell them to remember where we came from and maybe to imagine where we could go, to find connection, maybe feel a little less alone, a little less unhomely. Literature is still that collective memory, that shared brain, maybe even our instruction manual for being human.
So the story of literature isn't really about a finished library, is it? It's something still being written.
Exactly. That's the crucial final thought, I think. This global bookshelf isn't complete. It's alive, it's growing, changing every single day. Right now, somewhere, someone new is writing the next chapter. Maybe a story born from exactly these experiences of movement, connection, technology. A story that could challenge everything we think we know. It never really ends.
So as we wrap up this particular exploration of literature shaped by movement and the digital age, maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Considering all these forms we've touched on, the fragmented constellation novel, the Twitter story, hypertext, even fan fiction, which literary form, or maybe even a form we haven't seen yet, do you think best captures the way you experience life today? That feeling of constant motion, connection, maybe even fragmentation in the 21st century? Something to think about. And this was another episode from our series, The Story of Literature, from English Plus Podcast. Remember that what we mentioned is just an introduction for you to step into the huge and beautiful world of world literature, so don't settle for what you have learned in this series. Start hunting for the hidden gems you can find in literatures all around the world, and don't stray far at the beginning. Start from your own culture and literature. I bet there's a lot of magnificent works of literature to be found right in your own backyard. Thanks for listening. Stay curious and never stop learning with English Plus Podcast.